Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I'm here today to look at the finalists for the National Book Award for Fiction. This is very exciting. I do really love the National Book Award for Fiction. If you follow along, you know it is sort of one of my major literary book prize obsessions. And if you follow along, you know that the Pulitzer Prize is sort of my main obsession in that regard. But when I discovered the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, it was not long after that I also discovered the National Book Award for Fiction. And I think the only reason that the Pulitzer Prize latched onto me so hard and became my main obsession was that in those days, the National Book Award was very eccentric. It had some very off the beaten path, unexpected winners. It really loved sort of eccentric storytelling styles, and sometimes there were hits, sometimes there were misses. That meant that it was a little bit uneven in terms of quality. In recent years, that sort of unevenness in quality has gone away a little bit, and I think one thing that the National Book Award now is really interested in is sort of imaginative and creative ways of telling a story and sort of reinventing what literature can do. You can see that again and again. We have Interior Chinatown, which won a few years ago, a novel that is written in the style of a screenplay, which sort of gets out of the box of traditional storytelling tropes. And last year's winner, Blackouts by Justin Torres, is a book that really plays with the form of a novel and explores the negative spaces in what is left out. And you can see again and again, they sort of prize new and different approaches to literature. And I think that really is reflected in the books that made the cut onto the shortlist for the 2024 prize. And we will talk about that. And I have a theory about which direction this is going to go. We will see how that ultimately plays out. But first, we should talk about the books that made it onto the shortlist, and then I'll list the books that made it onto the shortlist first, and then I will go in depth on each of the books a little bit more, and then we will also talk about the books from the long list that did not make it onto the shortlist, and we will also talk about what I think is going to happen. That's sort of what the structure of this will be. If you are wanting to know dates, because dates are really important, the winner for the National Book Award will be announced on November 20th. That is a week after the Booker Prize will be announcing its winner. Sometimes the Booker and the National Book Award get very close. The year that Interior Chinatown won, the Booker ceremony was either the day before the National Book Award or the day after. I don't remember which, but they were back to back in terms of days. This year we get a week of separation. So the winners will all be announced on November 20th. And when I say will all be announced, I am referring to all of the different categories of the National Book Award, because like the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, they have other categories as well. There's fiction, which is what I'm going to be talking about today, but there's also nonfiction, poetry, translated literature, and young people's literature. My original intention had been to talk about all of the finalists in this video, and I have not managed to do that. Basically, the only thing I have really seen is that Salman Rushdie was on the finalist list for nonfiction, and I am kind of thinking he has a good chance of winning. I've heard so many good things about that book that I feel like that is probably the way it's going to go, but I also haven't really paid attention to the rest of the list. So at some point in the future, I will actually take some time and look at those lists. And, you know, if you follow along, you know, I was traveling over the last week. I'm actually filming this video 2 days after this list was announced. That's just the way things have been going. So I was traveling, got home late last night. And then because this was my first day back at work, it's been bedlam. So I'm filming this video even later in the day than I wanted to be filming it. So that is where I didn't have time to look at the other lists. It's not a very good excuse, but it is the way it is. So there you go. Hopefully at some point in the future, I will be looking at the other lists. Anyway, just to run through the books that are on the list of finalists for the National Book Award for Fiction, you have Ghost Roots, Stories by Pemi Aguda, Martyr by Kaveh Akbar, James by Percival Everett, All Fours by Miranda July, and My Friends by Hisham Matar. So actually, before we run into bigger talks about each of these books individually, let's just mention the elephant in the room, which is the crossover that the National Book Award for Fiction has had with the Booker Prize this year. There were, I think, 3 books on the long list that were also on the long list for the Booker Prize. And Interestingly, two of those books went on to the shortlist for the Booker Prize, and two of these books went on to the shortlist for the National Book Award. But only one book is on the shortlist for both, and that is James by Percival Everett. My Friends by Hisham Matar is probably the book that most people were upset did not make it onto the shortlist for the Booker Prize. I will have my reaction videos, by the way, to last year's National Book Award winner, to the Longlist for this year's National Book Award for fiction, and the shortlist for the Booker Prize this year down below, if you want to get more information about all of these titles. But I definitely think the book that most people were upset did not make it onto the shortlist for the Booker Prize was My Friends by Hisham Matar. And it did make it onto the shortlist here. So the kind of interesting differentials. And Creation Lake by Rachel Kushner is the other Booker book that is sort of in the mix here. And it made it onto the shortlist for the Booker, but it did not make it onto the shortlist for the National Book Award. And that's just kind of an interesting point of reference. It is different and unique for the National Book Award to have so much crossover with the Booker Prize. And it will be really interesting to see if there's crossover in the winner. I don't want to get into my prediction for how this will play out, but I do think that James is a top tier contender for both prizes. So it would not be unheard of for James to walk away with both of these prizes. And I know a lot of people get sort of upset and say that there should be a little bit of spreading the wealth among book prizes. I don't really subscribe to that notion. So I think it would be really cool for something to win both the Booker Prize and the National Book Award for fiction. And then it would be so interesting to see if James could go on to win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction next year, because someday it's going to happen that someone will win both a Pulitzer and a Booker. And James feels like the book that could do that. So anyway, I'll get into my actual prediction for how this is going to play out later. Before we do that, let's have a quick conversation about each of the books that made it onto the shortlist or the list of finalists for the National Book Award. The first one is, as I said, Pemi Aguda's Ghost Roots. This is a story collection. It kind of flirts with elements of magical realism. I don't know how magical realist it is because I have not actually read this book yet. And by the way, I should mention for anyone who wants to go down this road, I am not attempting to review books that I have not read. I'm sort of assessing the descriptions of the books. I like to use a long list or a short list to discover books that I might want to read. And sometimes if a book makes it onto a long list and I thought, I'm not sure I want to read that, and then it ends up making it onto the short list, sometimes it helps me reconsider books that I might have passed over. And Ghost Roots is one where I wasn't too sure about it, but now that it's on the short list, I find myself sort of wondering, maybe I should prioritize this book because I haven't been prioritizing it. And maybe I should rethink that. I have heard mixed feedback on Ghost Roots, and I think a lot of that comes down to the sort of imaginative way that it tells a story, which is catnip for the National Book Award for fiction, but is not something that every reader will be into. If you're someone who does not like magical realism, and again, I don't know that this is magical realism in Ghost Roots, but it does feel like it lends itself to sort of mythical forms of storytelling or sort of elements of magic and, or at least creative ways of telling stories. Like in one of them, for example, in Manifest, a woman sees the ghost of her abusive mother in her daughter's face. Shortly after, the daughter is overtaken by wicked and destructive impulses. So you have sort of supernatural elements or spiritual elements or magical elements coming into these stories. And if that's not your thing, then Ghost Roots probably won't be for you. And I think that is probably where the majority of the divide on that book is coming from. So it will be interesting to see what happens. I think because it is so frequently described as imaginative and creative, it does probably have a really good chance. Like I can easily see how Ghost Roots made it onto the list of finalists for the National Book Award. Will it win? I don't know. I'm not so convinced that it will. And a big part of that is the presence of Martyr by Kaveh Akbar, which is the next finalist that we are going to talk about, and also the presence of James by Percival Everett. But we'll get to James in a moment. Martyr is a book that I've heard great things about, and I've heard a lot negative things about. And I think, again, that comes down to how you respond to the way this story is told. And again, the National Book Award loves a book that plays with what literature can do or be. And in reviews for Martyr, it seems to be a book that plays in that direction hard and fast and just deep. Like, it goes in deep on the idea of trying to use fiction in a different way. It is a story where a man who has been an addict in the past is grappling with grief. He had lost his mother, and he's trying to adjust to he becomes obsessed with the concept of martyrs, and that sort of plays out throughout the book. And I don't want to get into like reading descriptions of each of these books, since we already did that with the Longlist, which will again be linked down below. But it feels like it's using very inventive ways of telling a story about grief and getting over addiction and familial trauma and things like that. And I have wanted to read it since it was released. I was actually sent this copy of the book by Knopf, and it includes this limited edition zine that was included in copies that were sent out by the publisher. I have one of 500 that were made, and that is a really fun thing to have. So I'm hoping I will read this book by the end of the year. Will I manage to read it before the National Book Award is announced? I don't know. I might try to do that, but I am also trying not to put pressure on myself to have read something by a specific date. So we'll see how that goes. But I definitely want to read this by the end of the year, because this feels like it's going to be a big contender for, say, the New York Times book reviews, 10 best books of the year. It will be a big contender for the Washington Post's 10 best books of the year. It was already factoring into things like the New York Times book reviews, 10 best books of the year so far back in June. It's already just making a lot of those appearances. So this definitely is something that I want to prioritize. I just don't know if I will make it happen before the National Book Award is announced. And I feel like we have a very heavy contender for the win in Martyr by Kaveh Akbar. And then we have James by Percival Everett, which is probably even more in line to appear on best of lists and book prize lists as we head into the end of the year, which, yes, we are heading into the end of the year, whether you are ready for it or not. That is happening. It's just happening. I was about to say it's going to happen. No, it's happening. So James is probably the most critically lauded book of the year. I think Martyr, because it is so inventive, because it plays a little bit, it has also been a little bit more cilantro. It's been something that people either love or, kind of don't respond to as much, even although they might respect what Martyr is doing. And James feels like a much more consensus choice among critics and readers. Percival Everett has been really on the rise in recent years. He's been writing for a long time, but once he became a Pulitzer Prize finalist for a book called Telephone, his next book was The Trees, which got him on the shortlist for the Booker Prize. And then his book Erasure was adapted into the movie American Fiction last year. So James, it feels like Percival Everett is in the stratosphere when it comes to literary talent of the moment. And it will be interesting to see. Again, as I said, this feels like a book that could win both the Booker and the National Book Award and the Pulitzer, to throw a third thing in. Like, this could be a hat trick book, but we'll talk about what I think is going to happen at the end. So if you're unfamiliar, I don't know where you've been, but James is a retelling of Huckleberry Finn. Or you could call it a retelling, you could call it a reimagining, a reinterpretation. You could go about it in some different ways, but basically it tells the story of Huckleberry Finn from the perspective of Jim, or James, as he comes to be known in this book. The book is told from his perspective. And Percival Everett subverts some of the characterizations of Jim that you got in Huckleberry Finn, and it gives you a very intelligent man who has to censor himself in order to get by and survive in society. And it also very heavily deals with the nature of storytelling and grapples with notions of being able to tell your own story and what it is to be able to tell your story when telling your story is really dangerous. And it grapples with racism and the implications of that racism and enslavement and all of those heavy, heavy, heavy issues. Even though I myself was a little unsure about the conclusion of this novel, I deeply, profoundly respect it. And for that reason, I'm happy to see it succeed. So this is the only book on the shortlist that I have read so far. I'm really hoping to get to Martyr. I might try to prioritize Martyr before the winner is announced. But as it stands right now, James is the only one that I have read. And I think it's a tremendous book, and it's wonderful. And I think it deserves all of the success and praise that it gets. So we'll see what happens with that one. The next finalist is All Fours by Miranda July. I had a copy of a story collection by Miranda July on my shelves for years and hadn't read it. So earlier this year, I did a thing where I took some of the books that had been on my shelves the longest and read a little bit from the opening, sort of like a version of the Try a Chapter videos that you sometimes see. And I got rid of the Miranda July book. It felt like I had sort of missed the window on that one. If I had read it when I first purchased it, I probably would have been into the sort of quirky storytelling techniques that it uses. And now I'm much more immune or resistant to those. So I got rid of that book. And when I heard about the description of All Fours, it sounded like all of the things that I wasn't into in that story collection that I unhauled earlier this year. So I have been of the opinion that, okay, well, All Fours, if you're into Miranda July, if you are into the description of the book, do you. That's fine. I'm going to let you have that, and I will sit on the sideline and just not engage with the book. I am surprised in a way to see that it made this shortlist. However, since Miranda July is that sort of quirky storyteller, she has the quirk to me feels almost forced or like too much, but I can see how that type of storytelling would actually appeal to a National Book Award jury because it is actually in the wheelhouse. I hadn't thought that it would make the list of finalists, but as soon as it did, it was kind of like, all right, she does have a sort of different approach to storytelling that the National Book Award probably would respond to. So actually, I do see it. And the final finalist for the National Book Award for Fiction 2024 is My Friends by Hisham Matar. As I said, this is the one that I think a lot of people were upset did not make it onto the shortlist for the Booker Prize. And it's not one that I have read. It is one that I would like to read. I admit I am prioritizing some other books that were on the long list for the National Book Award, but didn't make it onto the shortlist before I would get to My Friends. But it sounds fascinating, and I would be very interested to read it. And I think because so many people have responded to its story because it involves protest and violence from protest, which does kind of feel of the moment, I could very well be underrating My Friends when it comes to thinking about what could win the National Book Award for Fiction. But I think I would probably place My Friends in like third place in my prediction. I could very well be wrong about that. I could very well be wrong about any of my rankings because I'm putting Pemi Oguda and Ghost Roots sort of in fourth place and I'm putting All Fours last. But I can see what it would be about those books that might appeal to the jury for the National Book Award. So I could easily be wrong about these. But I think right now, my thoughts are My Friends would probably be running in third place, but I could absolutely see it surprising everyone and winning. And then I'd put Ghost Roots in fourth, All Fours in sort of last place, being honest. So before we talk about what I think is going to happen, let's take a quick look at the books from the long list that didn't make it onto the short list, and especially the ones that I am primed to read. The first one is The Most by Jessica Anthony. I was so happy to see it make the long list because it is something that I noticed and included on my list of upcoming releases for, I think it was the middle of the year, that I was really excited about. It's a novella, and I thought the description of it sounded wonderful, so I included it in my video. I requested that my library purchase a copy, and they have been in the act of purchasing it for about 3 months at this point. So I still have a hold on it, but my hold has been listed as pending for about 3 months at this point. And I would really like to read it. So I actually already wanted to read The Most by Jessica Anthony before it made it onto the long list. And now, even though it didn't make it onto the short list, I am still very interested in reading The Most by Jessica Anthony. Then we have a book that I'm holding in my hands, Catalina by Carla Cornejo Villavicencio. obviously, since I'm holding this in my hands, you can bet that this is something that I really wanted to read. It really jumped out to me from the long list as something that I would love to read. So I did the same thing I did with the most. I requested that my library purchase a copy. They decided that they would, and for whatever reason, because, sometimes things work slowly. Catalina became available, and I picked it up at the library, and I'm still waiting for the most. Can't explain why that's happening, but I'm really excited to read this. This will probably be my next print book once I finish the book that I am currently working on, which will hopefully be happening tonight. So I'm really looking forward to reading Catalina. And again, I really thought that this had a good shot. If I were predicting the shortlist, I think I would have easily slotted Catalina in instead of the Miranda July. But again, now that I see what the shortlist is, I'm not entirely surprised that Miranda July made it, but I am sort of disappointed that this didn't, even though I haven't read it yet. And by the way, gorgeous cover. Unfortunately, because it came from the library, it has this plastic on it that makes it very reflective, but I cannot wait to read that book. Creation Lake by Rachel Kushner, we already kind of talked about, because that is a book that was in the mix for the Booker as well. I was surprised to see it in the mix for the National Book Award, and admittedly, I was kind of surprised to see it on the list for the Booker, but we'll see what happens with the Booker. It is no longer in contention for the National Book Award for Fiction. I do have access to the audio for Creation Lake, and I have thought about whether or not I will read it. I feel like at this point I have seen some negative reviews, mostly negative reviews of it. And the context of those reviews has convinced me that I'm fine hanging back a little bit. I might reconsider at some point in the future, especially since I do have access to an audio. Another one that I'm sort of disappointed not to see make it onto the list of finalists is You're Dead by Sam Sachs. That just sounded like a perfect fit for the way the National Book Award prizes creative storytelling, and it sounded really fascinating. I did request that my library purchase a copy of this one as well. They delayed on making a decision on that one for a while, but it just this morning showed up in my hold list as pending because they are in the act of purchasing one. So I'm really excited to get to that one as well. So you can sort of see that there were more books on the long list that I had been excited about than there were that made it onto the shortlist. And that continues with the final book that didn't make it onto the shortlist, which is Rejection by Tony Tula Timute. I am so sorry. But there we are. This is another one that I requested that my library purchase, and just this morning it showed up as something that they are in the act of purchasing. So hopefully I will get to it soon, but as you see with The Most by Jessica Anthony, I don't know when I will actually get a copy of the book. And in recent years, the National Book Award has also been really good about considering stories from different generations, particularly stories told by younger authors, telling stories about younger people. You had Sarah Tancombe Matthews with All This Could Be Different, which is a really great early adulthood novel. And from what I've heard about Rejection, it's kind of in the same vein as that. And Sarah Tancombe Matthews made it onto the shortlist. So I thought there was a good chance that Rejection might, but here we are. I'm still really interested in reading it. So, I mean, right away, 1, 2, and 3 and 4. 4 out of the 5 books that didn't make it onto the shortlist are things that I am prioritizing ahead of all but one of the books on the shortlist that I have not read, and that is Martyr. So in my world, I am not at all surprised to see Martyr here. I'm not at all surprised to see James here. I'm actually not surprised to see My Friends here. So really, there was only room for 3 of these 4 books. But I would have liked to see some of them break through, just because, I mean, I can't fault Ghost Roots, because I love the idea that people will be discovering and reading that book. Hopefully people who will respond to its way of telling a story a little bit better than what's happened so far. But anyway, it is what it is. Let's talk about what I think is going to happen. As you can glean from my previous ranking, I think the top tier of contenders for the National Book Award for Fiction right now are Martyr by Kaveh Akbar and James by Percival Everett. And part of me wants to say that James feels like the easy winner here. I'm actually going to predict Martyr by Kaveh Akbar. And even though I would love to see a book get that hat trick, the National Book Award for Fiction, the Booker Prize, and the Pulitzer, I think there's more of a case for Martyr to be a successor to Blackouts by Justin Torres than there is for Percival Everett, especially since Percival Everett is already in the mix for the Booker Prize. Anyone you speak to who is a fan of the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction will say that James is probably the frontrunner, although frontrunner status means not much with the Pulitzer. The book that everyone thought was a frontrunner for the Pulitzer last year was Northwoods by Daniel Mason, and that wasn't even a finalist for the Pulitzer this past year. So we just don't know. But it feels like James is already out there. James is already big. James is going to be getting other book prizes. You could argue it doesn't necessarily need the help of the National Book Award. That's not what book prizes are supposed to do. And I think the National Book Award is not someone who would usually think about such a metric. And although James does tell a very inventive story, it's taking an existing classic and making you think about it in a very different way. That's not the same way of playing with storytelling that the National Book Award traditionally recognizes. Again, think of Interior Chinatown, which tells a novel in the form of a screenplay. Think of Blackouts, which erases lines of text and sort of fuses fact and fiction, real historical data, and an imagined fictionalized version of that. And it's just a book that is very prized for the way it tells a story. And I think of these two books, Martyr is the one that fits that criteria a little bit better. And that is probably the main thing that I think will give Martyr the edge in the competition here. I think the fact that you have so many books that sort of fit the brief, all of them feel a little bit secondary to the way Martyr has been prized for getting out of the box of traditional storytelling. This is sort of the one that has been consistently recognized for doing that this year. So I will not be surprised at all to see Martyr win. I just feel like you could make a case for any other book on this list, but Martyr is doing a lot of the things that the National Book Award likes to recognize in fiction. So for that reason, I think it will win. And then there's the sort of lesser angle of, and on top of that, James is already in the mix for other prizes. So this is sort of a big chance to reward Martyr, which has been overlooked by other book prizes so far, at least. I do think it's a good candidate for the New York Times Best Books of the Year. Possibly a good candidate for the Pulitzer next year. We'll have to think about it. But yeah, I am predicting Martyr by Kaveh Akbar, although I will not be surprised if James wins, and I really won't be surprised if My Friends wins. And who knows? It's the National Book Award for Fiction. There could be other surprises. That's the way I think this is going to go. I would love to hear what you think of what you think when it comes to who the winner will be. I'd love to hear what you think about the shortlist. If there are any books from the long list that you would have liked to slot in instead, let me know all of that stuff in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.